I think that we should not be afraid of winning, number one. Number two, that your prime minister, my president, and other Western leaders should be talking about what does a post-conflict Russia look like. I mean, we were not reluctant to talk about Germany that way or Japan. I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about that, and it turned out pretty doggone well. So why not plan for success? Why not start reaching out and communicating this? My sense actually, I mean, this has gone so bad for Russia. They have lost so many people, the Russians that you just sort of alluded to, which you just alluded, have lost so much. I mean, their once great life is gone. It may never come back for them unless there is a change on the other side. Now, I do want to be very, very clear. America has a bad record, a bad track record when it comes to regime change. I mean, we don't do it very well, so I'm absolutely not advocating that. But what I am advocating is that we should think about that possibility and be prepared for it and envision what does that look like. And then the Russians, this is up to them on is their life actually better having Vladimir Putin. I think my sense is that he actually has less and less power to do stuff now than a year ago or what we imagined. I think there are people that are starting to or the circle is closing in around them a little bit. I mean, the fact that Bagasian says what he does publicly, the ineptitude of people from the general staff of how they are doing this, I think that we won't know until after it happens. I think Putin's control is a lot less than maybe what I thought it was a year ago. You think a country at war, Ukraine, should be offered NATO membership now? Absolutely. First of all, they're the best army in Europe. The best army in Europe, Ukrainian army. The alliance is finally waking up. I think certainly the United States is finally waking up to the strategic importance of the Black Sea region. Ukraine is not an island. It matters to us not because we love the people, but because of where it sits on the map. And if we think strategically about the Black Sea region, we'll be a lot more clever in our interactions with our Turkish ally. We'll think differently about the Republic of Georgia and then the critical role of Ukraine, as well as our Romanian and Bulgarian allies. So having a strategic view of that region in the all domains diplomacy, information and economy, not just military, I think would lead us to the conclusion that we need Ukraine inside the alliance to have a good strategy for the Black Sea region. Secondly, if I wouldn't expect membership to be offered in Vilnius, and unfortunately, I don't even think we're going to hear a clear declaration of membership action plan in Vilnius, but something that is more tangible than saying we hope one day. I mean, there needs to be something tangible to begin to build this. Now, I think the United States has a huge responsibility here to shepherd this process, and which means we have to fix our bilateral relationship with Ukraine. And billions of dollars of stuff is going to Ukraine, but we don't have a normal relationship. I mean, we've got to get a normal bilateral relationship and demonstrate that we're going to help in every facet of Ukraine's rebuilding, their continued orientation towards the West and democratic principles, to work closely with the European Union and the UK on helping Ukraine develop into a full, strong, confident, liberal democratic country. And then I think then we'll be in a place where their membership becomes not only feasible but absolutely desired by every other member. That won't happen as long as Russia occupies Crimea, and Crimea is like a dagger into the belly of Ukraine. Ukraine will never be able to really rebuild their economy as long as Russian forces occupy Crimea and block access to all the ports. What I'm trying to say, we have got to help Ukraine win, to include getting Crimea so that they can be on track to become a member of the alliance. I think it's not good strategic thinking or helpful to say there's no way they can join as long as Russia still occupies or they are still at war. I mean, that gives some countries an easy out rather than thinking strategically about what do we want. How do we protect Europe? How do we protect all of Europe from Russian aggression or Iranian attacks or any other threats that are out there? And I think that means you have to think strategically about the greater Black Sea region. and that means Ukraine as a member of the alliance. We've talked about the importance of making sure that Ukraine does not lose, that Russia does not win. But it seems to me that we have stopped short of declaring exactly what the final strategic objective is, which should be total restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty over all of its territory, including Crimea, return of deported Ukrainians, especially the 200,000 Ukrainian children who have been kidnapped and taken to Russia. Those kind of things should be clarified. I've been frustrated by the reluctance to take the next sort of 5% of the way to declaring what our objective is. I think it goes to a variety of potential explanations, concern about escalation, which I think has been overestimated. There still are too many people in European capitals and in Washington that are somehow cannot get their head around the idea that Russia should and will be defeated on the battlefield. And then I think there's concern about implications with China and other external actors. I just can't tell what those are yet. It's hard to imagine that we would get back to business as usual with Russia anytime soon, certainly not with the current leadership that's in place and most of the other sort of well-known faces there in the Kremlin. We don't know what will happen once Russia has been defeated. I think that there certainly is a lot of informed analysis that's looking at the possibility of either a breakup of the Russian Federation or some change of who's in charge there. I'm not advocating for any of that, but I think we have to be open-eyed and think about the possibilities and the implications. But put that aside, just can't imagine that it would be business as usual. You know, within a few weeks or months after the conclusion of this conflict, there will always be a Russian state, and we will need to work with them for all the big issues that are important to us now. But I think that the emphasis needs to be on protecting the international rules-based order, which includes respect for boundaries, respect for international law, respect for human rights. And we also need to focus on getting Ukraine back up on its economic feet. We need to get the millions of refugees back home to Ukraine, and we also need to help Ukraine start producing grain and exporting grain again that is needed for millions of people in Africa and Asia. I was at the International Criminal Court back several weeks ago, and I am confident that they are doing a lot of hard work right now, building cases for war crimes by leadership from the Kremlin, specifically for these deportations of Ukrainian children, genocide and, the daily attacks on power grids and civilian targets. These are all war crimes. I would be shocked if after this conflict ended that we saw Foreign Minister Lavrov or President Putin or any of the other current leadership team showing up at being welcomed at international events. It would be a betrayal. I mean, all of these people are going to be, I think, investigated and charged with war crimes. I mean, basically what they say publicly and what we're all watching every single day. So I'll be interested in tracking that on the reparations front. Certainly, I think there's going to have to be some responsibility by Russia to help pay for the rebuilding of Ukraine. But, I always have a little bit of a problem with reparations because usually, as we saw after the First World War and the Second World War and in other wars, those reparations can have a negative side as well. The fact that Poland today is asking for 1.3 trillion euro reparations from their NATO and EU partner, Germany, is a manifestation of that. So I'm more focused on the war crimes than I am on reparations. But certainly Russia would have to bear some of the costs for rebuilding Ukraine. We've learned a lot or been reminded about what's required for sustained land combat, the ammunition consumption, specifically the numbers of casualties, the losses of vehicles and aircraft. It's astounding, and so all of us are having to retool our defense industries and figure out ways to counter this mass that Russia has employed. We don't necessarily have to match it with mass. In fact, precision can defeat mass as long as you have enough of the precision weapons. And my sense is that we're going to stick with it. Of course, just recently the White House. Our reports are coming out of the Pentagon that the White House is going to approve the delivery of Patriot missile defense systems to Ukraine. that's not signed by the president yet. But the fact that that's being released from the Pentagon tells me it's probably going to happen. That is a significant step by the White House, because those are expensive and we don't have many of them. So the fact that the White House is doing that to me is a very encouraging sign. And the president has said this. And of course, we're on the backside now of the US midterm elections. He's got strong bipartisan support for continuing this help to Ukraine. And I think the Congress and the administration recognize that this is not just about Ukraine, this is about this international rules-based order. It's about ensuring stability and security in Europe, which is important for American prosperity, because our prosperity depends on European prosperity. And then finally, it's about deterrence of China, that the Chinese are watching to see can we stick together and help Ukraine defeat Russia. It looks to me that Ukraine has achieved irreversible momentum, that there is no way that Russia can turn that back. And even President Zelensky had said, I don't need troops, I need the tools, the equipment, the ammunition and so on. And so I think the path we're on now, as long as the West sticks together and delivers everything that we said, we're going to deliver and keep the sanctions in place. This does not have to go to a conflict involving NATO directly versus Russia. He will be us, will be all of us sticking together. Now, the Kremlin needs the narrative. I mean, they have to be able to explain to their own population why this special military operation has turned into such a disaster for them, because it would be very difficult to say, well, you know, we're getting crushed by Ukraine, so they need to somehow justify what they are doing to their own population by expanding the narrative to say that this is Russia against NATO. My assessment is that Ukraine will have liberated Crimea by the end of summer, by August of 2023. I don't know how much of the Donbass will still be partly occupied. I think that most of the people that live in those so-called separatist territories actually would prefer to be part of Ukraine versus Russia. But the decisive terrain, if you will, is Crimea. Ukraine will never be secure as long as Russia still illegally occupies part of Crimea. So I believe that by the end of summer, Ukraine will have achieved that. It's too early to plan a victory parade, but there certainly is going to be many months of hard fighting between now and then. The Russians will continue to go after civilian targets in hopes of extending this conflict for the purpose of causing us to lose our will. But I don't think that's going to happen. We know that war is a test of will, and clearly the Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian people have superior will. So it's a matter of logistics, and the Russian logistics system is very fragile. It's under enormous pressure. The Ukrainian General Staff is doing a very good job pounding away at Russian logistics and what we call the lines of communication, the main supply routes. There's only two roads that lead into Crimea. One is over the Kerch Bridge, which is already severely damaged. And then there's the so-called land bridge that runs through Mariupol and Melitopol. And the Ukrainians hit an important bridge in Melitopol yesterday or the day before. So they are already disrupting the two land routes that lead into Crimea. And to me, Crimea increasingly looks like a trap. The large-scale offensive operation of the Ukrainian army continues from 5 different front lines already. Former British Army intelligence officer Philip Ingram had reported that the first phase of the Ukrainian counter-offensive had begun a few weeks ago. The Ukrainians continue active offensive operations in the Luhansk, Bakhmut, Solder, Volodar, Zaporizhia, Melitopol, Tokmak, Mariupol, and Berdyansk directions. The first direction of the large-scale attacks of the Ukrainian army on 5 different fronts is Donetsk. Russia's defense ministry reported that Ukraine thwarted a major offensive in Donetsk in the final sign that a wider counter-offensive may have begun. The Ukrainian Air Force launched 17 attacks on the concentration of Russian troops on the Donetsk front line and 4 more attacks on enemy air defense systems. A Russian Su-25 attack aircraft and 4 reconnaissance aircraft were also destroyed. In addition, the Ukrainian army launched a large-scale offensive on the Donetsk front line using 6 mechanized and 2 tank battalions. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that Ukraine has deployed 6 mechanized and 2 tank battalions from the 23rd and 31st Mechanized Brigades into battle. As the sun rose over Ukraine, Russian pro-war Telegram channels commonly known as Mil bloggers began to present a less rosy picture of Russia's defense in the region. Alexander Khodakovsky, who served as the battalion commander and officer in Russia's proxy presence in Donetsk Oblast, reported that Ukrainian forces also carried out effective attacks near the town of Volodar in the southwest of Donetsk Oblast. Ukrainian forces continued to trap the Russians in the corridor from the central city of Donetsk to Volodar after the Ukrainian attacks reported by Alexander Khodakovsky. The general situation in Volodar began to change in favor of Kiev when the Ukrainians seized the advantage in the region. They continued to pile up their reinforcements in these areas. Ukrainian Ground Forces Commander Oleksandr Kursky reported that troops were advancing towards Bakhmut and destroyed a Russian position near the city. The head of the pro-Moscow Vostok Battalion, Alexander Khodakovsky, told Telegram that in the Novodonetsk settlement located between Volodar and Velikaya Novoselivka, Ukrainian troops achieved tangible losses and achieved tactical success. After these striking offensive operations, the second offensive axis of the Ukrainians was the Luhansk front line. Russian authorities have reported shelling attacks on the Luhansk region in eastern Ukraine. It was noted that Ukraine used HIMARS rockets supplied by the USA in these attacks. In addition, the Russian Ministry of Defense reported that Ukrainian planes hit 2 industrial areas in the Russian-controlled city of Luhansk in eastern Ukraine, with Storm Shadow long-range cruise missiles supplied by the United Kingdom. On the same day as these attacks, smoke was seen rising above an old aviation school used by the Russian army in the east of Luhansk. Moscow-based local officials said Kiev carried out the attack with 2 Storm Shadow long-range missiles supplied by the British. It turned out that an administrative building was damaged. This striking attack followed a similar attack in Luhansk that destroyed a high-rise building and slightly injured a Russian lawmaker. Russian state media cited parts it said came from Storm Shadow rockets. After these striking attacks, another explosion occurred in the city center. The explosion occurred in a crowded barber shop. Major General Igor Kornet, Minister of the Interior of the Luhansk People's Republic, was apparently seriously injured while sitting in the barber's chair as a result of the attack. 1 person was killed and 5 others were injured, effectively controlled by Russia. Since 2014, Luhansk has been in a relatively peaceful state since President Putin's large-scale invasion last year. But the Luhansk front line now means that the Ukrainians are suddenly vulnerable with the provision of Storm Shadow missiles with a range of over 250 kilometers, with Russian bases and weapons depots positioned far from the conflict. The Ukrainian military did not immediately comment on Russia's claim for attacks on the Luhansk front line and rarely publicly claimed responsibility for such attacks. These offensive operations in Luhansk would actually allow the Ukrainians to hit the Russian troops and resupply the depots far behind the front lines in preparation for a major counteroffensive. In other words, although the Ukrainians do not take responsibility for these attacks, the gains in Luhansk are beneficial to them. If we move to the third axis of the offensive operation on 5 different front lines after Luhansk, we will have to go to surprises. Explosions occurred in 2 occupied areas of Zaporizhia. Here we witnessed that Russia is building effective defensive fortifications. The HIMARS and Storm Shadow missile attacks of the Ukrainian forces also affected Zaporizhia. After Zaporizhia, the 4th offensive axis of the Ukrainians was the city of Melitopol. Residents of the village of Myrna in the Melitopol region reported a powerful explosion near a military unit captured by Russian forces. The Russians tried to deploy high-precision air defense systems. Already, the Ukrainian armed forces had carried out an effective missile and artillery attack on a Russian military base in this city. A few days after this attack, the Russians began to worry as the tension in the city escalated again. Melitopol is of vital importance for the Crimean Peninsula, which is the key to the great liberation plans of the Ukrainian armed forces. Based on this plan, it is quite easy to guess that the place where the last offensive axis of the Ukrainian armed forces is located is the city of Tokmak. The city of Tokmak is in the south of Ukraine. Also, this city is seen as part of the Ukrainian corridor of ground attack to retake the Crimean Peninsula. For this reason, the Ukrainians are conducting serious offensive operations in this city as well. In recent days, Tokmak residents have reported at least 6 explosions. It was reported that a Russian ammunition depot was destroyed as a result of these attacks. Russian occupation authorities in Zaporizhia Oblast, on the other hand, began to move local collaborators and training workers deep into the occupied territory from Tokmak to Berdyansk. But we know that the violent attacks of the Ukrainian armed forces, both in Berdyansk and in the city of Mariupol, continue. In fact, the cities of Berdyansk and Mariupol are among the operational plans in the city of Tokmak, which is seen as the 5th offensive axis of the Ukrainians. The city of Berdyansk in Zaporizhia Oblast is located on the coast of the Sea of Azov, about 100 kilometers southeast of Tokmak. The city of Mariupol is on the Azov coast and has an important port. In summary, the Ukrainians are trying to achieve the great liberation by conducting effective operations on both the eastern and southern front lines. There is a lot of good news when it comes to the Belgorod region. The insurgent forces are ramping up the intensity of their attacks, and today, the commander of the Russian Volunteer Corps reported that they completed the clearing of the village. Janka, the head of the Belgorod region, confirmed that Russian forces lost control over the settlement and that the situation does not look promising for Russians at this time. As the clashes continued, combat footage showed how the insurgents destroyed at least 4 new tanks and armored fighting vehicles. Combat footage also confirmed that the insurgents took captive new Russian soldiers due to the reluctance of the head of the Belgorod region to organize a prisoner exchange. The head of the Wagner Group, Prigozhin, made an announcement stating that if the Russian officials do not care about their people, then he will take care of it himself. The commander of the insurgent detachment recognized a unique opportunity to drive another wedge between Prigozhin and the Russian Ministry of Defense and made an announcement that from now on they will cooperate with Prigozhin when it comes to the Bakhmut direction. Ukrainians continue to advance. Today, the Ukrainian Deputy Minister of Defense reported that Ukrainians made a series of successful assaults on the northern Bakhmut flank. The head of the Wagner Group, Prigozhin, took an opportunity to criticize the regular Russian army for letting Ukrainians enter Bajivka. Some sources indicate that other attacks were directed towards Dubovo, Vasilyevka, Paraskeva and Zelinsky, but at the moment there is no geolocated footage to confirm the gains. The situation on the southern Bakhmut flank is even more favorable for Ukrainians. As expected, Ukrainians quickly started using their gains to conduct a pincer movement on Kievska. A commander of a detachment on the ground reported that Russians in Kievska are about to abandon their positions because Ukrainians destroyed their logistics in the region and there is no hope of support. Ukrainian soldiers released a warning to the Russian soldiers to leave their positions as soon as possible or they will die from artillery fire. After seeing no movement, the Ukrainians opened intense fire. The intercepted radio exchanges revealed extreme panic and desperation. After demonstrating what was waiting for them, the Ukrainians stopped the fire and issued another warning to leave Kosivka because they were operationally encircled. But the biggest news today, once again, comes from the south. Russian sources claimed that the Russian forces conducted a counterattack and pushed the Ukrainians out of Neskikny. Later, Russian sources reported that Ukrainians somehow assaulted the next settlement on the line storage away and again used several motorized rifle companies. Russian sources claim that the attack was repelled and Ukrainians were pushed out of these 2 settlements. Ukrainian sources reported that they captured Storazev. It looks like Russian Ukrainians were withdrawing their heavy equipment from the contact line after the assault and considered that Ukrainians retreated due to their intense artillery fire. However, as some analysts pointed out, Ukrainians likely left light infantry in the trenches to hold the area while prudently saving the equipment from the artillery fire. And such a decision is not surprising, especially given how small and vulnerable to artillery fire the settlements are and how intensely Russians used incendiary munitions. Today at night, when it comes to Novogorodievka here, it looks like Russian forces indeed managed to recapture the village. Nonetheless, the Ukrainians retained control over the fields in front of the settlement, which made it easier to attack. Russian sources reported that Ukrainians assaulted Novogorodievka from the north and used up to 1 battalion tactical group. However, the main Ukrainian attack came from the opposite direction. The commander of the Russian volunteer battalion Vostok reported that Ukrainians tricked Russian forces by making it look like they were preparing to reinforce the small attacks in the western part. He stated that this allowed Ukrainians to close the distance almost undetected, and because Ukrainians also simultaneously jammed radio signals, Russians could not request support and were defeated shortly. Ukrainians also launched assaults in the direction of Orogeny and Novomayorsk, but just like last time, the goal was not to immediately capture the next settlements, but rather widen the bridgehead and establish positions in the fields. Such a combination of highly coordinated actions allowed Ukrainians to achieve a very difficult task: cross the river, dissipate, and establish a wide bridgehead. The Russian Ministry of Defense reported that Ukrainians launched a large-scale counter-offensive operation but were stopped by the Vostok Battalion and did not achieve any objectives. They also reported that Russian forces destroyed 30 tanks, 11 Leopards and IMX-10, more than 100 armored fighting vehicles, and 1,500 soldiers, which almost exceeded the number of forces used for this attacks. The lower-level commanders of the Russian forces on the ground reported that they faced a new issue because the fields and roads are overly mined. Russian forces started blowing themselves up on their own mines. It looks like due to the increasing intensity of the Ukrainian counter-offensive, Russian forces start making mistakes because of the immense emotional pressure. It was reported that Russian forces lost their best assault and reconnaissance drone operators right before the Ukrainians delivered their main blow. This means that Russian forces put themselves in a very inconvenient situation by mining everything around them. If Ukrainians attack from an unexpected direction, Russians may find themselves between the attackers and minefields, cut off from reinforcements and retreat routes.